All right, this is a presentation on the paper Music and Language. Do they draw on similar syntactic working memory resources by Anna Fiveash and Kristen Pammer. Before I start this presentation, I did just want to say that a lot of the background, especially that I'm going to be talking about, ties in very closely to the Slevik et al. 2009 paper that we read earlier in class. So it probably wouldn't hurt to give that a once over. I will be explaining a lot of the background, but it does tie in really closely. One of the most influential ideas in the field of music cognition has to do with shared processes between music and language. In 2003, Ani Patel came up with the Shared Syntactic Resources Integration Hypothesis, or the SSIRH. And what that hypothesis essentially says is that music and language are separate in terms of how they represent different syntactic features of each, but they share between them their resource networks. So again, they're two very separate ideas, separate entities, but they do share that processing between them. The Slevik et al. Paper that we read in class supported that idea when they had the syntactic garden path sentences paired with syntactic, the music manipulation, so that out-of-key chord. There was an effect between the two of them, so it kind of overloaded those shared processes between the two of them, but there was no such interaction with the semantic manipulation, which indicates that the shared processing between the two has to do with syntax. The SSIRH is a pretty widely accepted idea throughout the community. So the idea that they're two separate entities, people generally agree on. The only thing that's up for debate is kind of what those shared resources are. So the SSIRH and the Slevik 2009 paper would agree that it's syntactic integration. But there have been some other findings that contradict that. So a 2015 paper by Slevik and Akata kind of reanalyzed how they were looking at it and made it a little bit more broad. So it wasn't just syntax that was shared, but this idea of cognitive control or having to go back and reinterpret something that you've just listened to or just read. This study posits a third idea where it's something called syntactic working memory that is shared between music and language. The idea of syntactic working memory is kind of a new one. The theory was posited in 2010. And this idea, so SWM is thought to be domain general, so it's not just for language, it's not just for music, it's all spread out through various parts of the brain for various different domains. And what it does is hold syntactic information while the rest of the sentence or the musical piece that you're listening to is processed through working memory. We're all familiar with Baddeley's model of working memory, which is comprised of the phonological loop, the visuospatial sketchpad, and the central executive. A newer part of it is the episodic buffer, which essentially integrates information across the other three aspects. Although this is a really comprehensive model, it does not explain how syntax is processed. And so it's thought that the SWM, syntactic working memory, is part of this working memory model, but separate from the other four aspects of it. What this study is aiming to do is to investigate further whether that syntactic working memory is in fact the shared resources between the two domains of music and language. So in terms of the music stimuli, Fiveash and Pammer took the same syntactic manipulations that Slevik et al. In 2009 did, where they'd have a chord progression where either all the chords were in key or one chord was glaringly out of key. So we'll start with an example of a chord progression where everything is in key. And then here is that same progression, but with one out of key chord. So see if you can spot the difference. So that was the musical manipulation. In terms of the linguistic stimuli, the participants would see word list and complex sentences. So the word lists were comprised of short monosyllabic words not really related to each other, and then complex sentences, with the idea being that complex sentences are processed in SWM, but the word lists are not. Word lists are processed in the phonological loop, which is separate from SWM. Because of this, they hypothesized that accuracy would decrease for reading the complex sentences, but not for the word list. So they thought that when there was that out-of-key chord, so that syntactically manipulated chord progression with a complex sentence, then it would decrease their accuracy in recalling it. So it would affect their memory in the sentences, but not for the word lists, which are again separate in the phonological loop. So the participants would be presented with either a list or a sentence on the screen. A sample list might say something like sand, bat, light, pear, and mole. And an example complex sentence would be something like, the host who the contestant offended ruined the show for the audience. Unlike the Slavic experiment, which used piano music, this experiment made it a little bit more realistic, so a little bit less of a lab setting, and used guitar music. There were 8-second guitar pieces that played while the word list or the sentence was displayed. And then as soon as the music stopped playing, the words would disappear, and participants were asked to read back either the list of words or their sentences. There was also one more musical condition that acted as a control. Everything was in key, so it was all in key chords, but instead of that one out of key chord, there was one chord that was played with a different instrument. This is the semantic manipulation used in the Slavic study. In this experiment, it's just to act as a control to rule out the possibility that people were just getting distracted by the out of key chord. So this experiment used a manipulation where it was all guitar and then one flute chord to act as a control. All right, so we're going to try a couple trials here. I'm going to show you either a list or a sentence while the music plays, and then when the screen goes blank, I want you to repeat out loud as many words on the list or as much of the sentence as you can. So here is the first screen. There's going to be a target to look at, and then the list will appear, and then it'll go away. So here is the first one. And those were the words on the original list. All right, we're going to try one more. So again, you're going to see the little cross, and then you'll see the stimuli, and then you'll have a blank screen. So here is the second one. All right, and this was the sentence that you read. When the experimenters went back and listened to the recording, they came up with a score system with which to score the recording. So if they totally messed up, then it started at omit, they would not use it, and then upwards they went error, partial error, mostly correct, or all correct. And you can see that there's different specific criteria for both the word list and the sentences for each different grade level. So looking at the first graph of results, we see 3 different bars for each of the different musical conditions. So the darkest bar on the leftmost side is the normal, all in key, all guitar. The middle bar on each section is the syntactic manipulation, that out of key chord. And then the rightmost bar, kind of the middle colored, is the instrument manipulation, so the one flute chord. And then the y-axis is accuracy, so on that rating scale of how correct they were when recalling. And you can see overall people did a lot better recalling word lists than they did sentences. The biggest takeaway from this graph, I would say, is looking at the syntactic manipulation. Nothing really going on in the word list, but it is hugely detrimental to the accuracy in the complex sentences, which is what was predicted by the experimenters. Participants were also asked about their musical ability when they came in, and based on where they put themselves on the scale, they were either classified as musician or non-musician. The vast majority of participants rated themselves as amateur, and none of them were considered professional musicians. When the experimenters ran some statistical analyses on those ratings, they found that musicians had borderline significance for interference within sentences, which essentially means that they were affected by whether the stimulus was a word list or sentence, as non-musicians were. But it was found that musicians had the highest recall across all conditions for word lists and the lowest for sentences across conditions. Looking at the graphs for musicians and non-musicians, we have musicians on the left, non-musicians on the right, and it's the same coloring for the musical manipulations. The left bar is normal, the middle bar is syntactic manipulation, and the rightmost bar is the instrument manipulation. Looking at the musicians' accuracy, you can see that jump from syntactic manipulation in the word list to the syntactic manipulation in the sentences is totally exacerbated. It's totally huge and very much so affected, much more so than the non-musicians in the right graph. You can also see that the non-musicians were a little bit more stable between the two linguistic conditions, so the reading times for word lists are about the same as the reading times for sentences, whereas there's a really big difference in the musicians between word list and sentences. So again, the musicians were really, really good at recalling word list and pretty poor at recalling the complex sentences. So just to summarize the findings again, the hypothesis was supported by the results. The memory for complex sentences decreased when paired with the out-of-key condition, but this pattern was not found in the word list. Again, experimenters believe this was going to happen because complex sentences are processed in syntactic working memory, whereas the word lists were processed in a different part of the working memory in the phonological loop. This also gives support to the idea that the syntactic working memory is the shared processing system posited in the SSIRH. Going back and talking a little bit more about the difference in the musicians versus non-musicians, the musicians did have higher recall in the word list, and the experimenters thought that that might be because musicians are good at rehearsing. They rehearse their music, they rehearse over and over and over again. So it's possible that they just have better and more advanced rehearsal mechanisms, which would be very helpful in recalling the word list, but not so much in the complex sentences. One limitation that I did want to touch on, and that the authors touched on as well, is the nature of the musicianship measure. It was a self-reported measure. So participants just said what they thought they were on a scale of, non-musician to professional musician. I don't think that that's the best measure of musicianship. If they knew they were looking at musicianship as one of the factors in their study, I would have given them a musicianship measure, so some sort of test that actually tested their musicianship, as well as asking for years of experience, or maybe giving them another self-rated measure. But I don't think that listening to what someone calls themselves on a scale of musicianship is enough to define someone as a musician or as a non-musician. Something else to think about, and I'm not sure if we talked about this when we were discussing the Slevik 2009 paper, but something to think about is that they were reading the linguistic stimuli while they were listening to the music. So that's across two different modalities and two different parts of the brain. So something to consider when moving forward, or even just comparing this study to other studies in the field, is to remember that it's across two different modalities, and maybe think about doing something where both the language and the music were presented while you're listening to them, instead of reading one and listening to the other. All right, that's the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.